Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? So hello, everyone. Welcome to Ask the Grant Writing Experts. I'm Dr. Meg Bouvier. You know me as the creator of your library of NIH grantsmanship courses. I have over 35 years of experience at NIH as an applicant and intramural researcher, a staff writer, and now a full-time NIH grant mentor. I've helped clients land over $500 million in federal funding, and I'm here to answer your NIH grant writing questions. So grab a cup of coffee and let's get started. So if you're attending live, just a reminder that you are in listen-only mode. You can go ahead and start typing questions. If you look at your toolbar, there's a Q&A box. Go ahead and start putting questions in there. I know I was emailed maybe 4 or 5 questions during the course of the week that I'll be reviewing. But people who ask questions live at the meeting always take precedence. So feel free to load up the Q&A box. If you're watching this as a recording, just a reminder, today is August 21st, 2024. So everything that I say today is true to the best of my knowledge today. But things change quickly at NIH, so always check to make sure that the information is still accurate. And of course, the information that's contained in this live stream Q&A is not meant to replace the advising you would get from your program officer. You should always double check everything with your program officer. So what you should be viewing in the library now, well, given that this is kind of late August at this point, I would imagine that if you were submitting for an October deadline, you're rounding the bend on closing in on the finish line of your draft research strategy, I hope. So probably you would be, looking at chapter 4 of Master the R-series, which deals with the approach and the details of writing the approach, some of which we're going to talk about in the mini tutorial today. You might also be looking at, other courses like checklists to avoid top mistakes. And if you are an early bird to the February deadlines, good for you. And you would probably be watching something like chapter 1 of Master the R-series, which is all the prep steps. I'll also say for those who are preparing a resubmission application for November or beyond, yesterday I recorded an update to Master resubmissions, and I imagine that that will be released in our library within the next 1 to 2 weeks. So keep your eyes peeled for that. There's a brand new update of that course coming soon. In terms of the NIH updates, as you know, this is going to be the last cycle for which you would submit an application under the traditional scoring criteria, where there are 5 numerically scored criteria. Beginning for applications submitted on or after January 25th, it's going to be the new scoring criteria where you have factor 1 and factor 2, and we'll be discussing that at length come October. The upcoming sessions, which are September 4th and 18th, are both Q&A for cycle 3. Once we hit October, we're going to start talking about all the changes coming down the pike in terms of the scoring criteria, and a little later in 25 changes to the bio-sketch. Okay, so let's start with the mini tutorial, and then I'm going to move on to the questions in the Q&A box, and then we'll talk about the questions that were emailed to me during the course of the week. So let me do a screen share. Okay, so you guys should be seeing where and how to write up preliminary data in an NIH R-series application. So if you're not seeing that, let me know, but that's what you ought to be seeing, I hope. So often I get this question asked, the question of where to write up your preliminary data usually crops up when a person is writing the draft of their significance section. And the reason for that is that there's a section in significance, a sub-scoring criteria called rigor of prior research. It's the first of the 4 rigor scoring criteria within NIH grant applications. So the rigor of prior research is where you should be assessing the strengths and weaknesses of the handful of studies, not 30 studies, but maybe just a handful of studies that most closely inform the design of the proposed application. These can be studies that are published or not, yours or others, or typically a combination of these things. So as a person is working on their significance draft, often they'll ask me, okay, so where do I talk about my preliminary data for this project? Is this where it goes? Because that it could potentially go there. It could, but that is not my preference. So I'll explain the way I prefer to do it, and then I'll show you some examples of that, but then I'll explain other examples as well. So there are three potential places where your preliminary data can reside in the research strategy. And it could be in any one of these three, or it could be in a combination of these three. The first place would be in the significance where you're talking about preliminary data. The second and third places are both in the approach, and that's actually my preference, to have the detailed discussion of your preliminary data in the approach section, because I think that's where reviewers, like myself, when I'm reviewing a grant application, I'm fully expecting to find the detailed discussion of the preliminary data in the approach section. But that doesn't mean that you can't mention it in the significance section, because as you're giving the underpinnings, the rationale for the proposed project, it's often logical for you to at least mention some of the key take-home messages of your preliminary data, and or to include it within a discussion of the rigor of prior research. So rather than repeating yourself, what I really like to do is give some sort of a summary of the high-level take-home messages of your preliminary data in the significance section, and then refer reviewers to the approach for the full write-up. And this is one of the reasons that I really like using an outline for the research strategy, because you can refer them to a very specific place in the approach. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a moment. So a really typical template for a significance might be, and by convention nowadays, people label their applications A, significance, B, innovation, C, approach. The instructions tell you that those are the three main subheaders: significance, innovation, and approach. And by convention, most people just label them A, B, and C. Don't ask me why, but that's what's being done now. So a really typical outline for the significance might be A1, clinical problem; A2, scientific background; A3, rigor of prior research; A4, proposed project; A5, impact. Very typical. There are many other ways to do it, but this is a really typical way to do it. So two places where you might give that high-level overview of your preliminary data are in A3 and A4 of this outline: the rigor of prior research and the proposed project. So let me give you an example from an application I worked on in the previous grant cycle. So this is an R15 area grant that I worked on for the June deadline. So what I want you to see here is that this was the rigor of prior research section, and I want you to see how I structured this. So building on the foundation, this is anonymized, of XYZ tool development, our novel intervention was crafted through CBPR. Data from preliminary study 1, because they're numbered in the approach section, and then I put details and approach C21, endorsed acceptability, appropriateness, feasibility, and capacity to enhance healthy beliefs regarding XYZ. So in a rigor of prior research section, that's how I might refer to, give kind of a high-level overview of the relevant take-home messages from that preliminary study, the parts that are relevant to the rigor of prior research. Similarly, when I get to the proposed project section, I give a high-level overview of some key take-home messages from the preliminary data as they pertain to the proposed project. So here, we propose to address these gaps by building on 2 foundational and 2 implementation pilot studies. In our implementation pilot studies, details in C.2.1-2, our intervention and accompanying survey instruments were designed and refined with over 760 adolescents, et cetera. So that gives you an idea of, I'm not giving an exhaustive description of the preliminary data. This isn't the place where I put my figures and my tables and all of that. I'm just giving some really high-level take-home messages that are relevant to either the rigor of prior research and or the proposed project. That's my preferred way to do it in significance. It is not wrong for you to do the entire analysis of your preliminary data there. Many successful applicants do that. It's just not my preference. I like to keep the significance tighter and a little more salesy, for lack of a better word, and then keep the details in the approach. So going to the approach, if you are going to talk about preliminary data within the approach, they could go by multiple names, just so you know, you're not wedded to calling it preliminary data. It could be pilot studies, pilot data, supporting evidence. You can use any of these. One of the things that I see people do is to either list out by project, group by scientific theme. So maybe there's some scientific area and you have a series of studies that fall under that scientific area. You could group it that way. Or even by researcher, particularly if you have teams at different locations. So maybe you have a PI on a sub-project or sub-study, and their team has a set of preliminary data. You could break it up that way as well. But most typically, it's broken down by project, particularly if you are junior faculty in a single PI. You would just have each study be preliminary study 1, 2, 3, etc. So there are different places that you could list this information. And as I said, there are 3 of them. One of them is the significance, which we just talked about. There are 2 different places in the approach where you might see this as well. And you could potentially be listing preliminary studies in all 3 of these places, or just one. What matters is that you're telling the story in a way that feels intuitive to you, that feels logical to you. And each application might be different. So it's not as if, well, I've made a decision that, this is how I'm going to describe this grant. And so all grant applications I write from now on are going to be described that way. That's not the case. Each one, you decide what feels intuitive to you in terms of how to tell the story. So typically the places where you see the information described in the approach. So remember, we've already talked about a place, actually 2 places that you could describe it within the significance. Within the approach, you might describe it at the beginning of the approach if it is preliminary data that pertains to the whole project, or if it's preliminary data that pertains specifically to one or another aim, you might describe the preliminary data under each aim. And it's okay to have a summary of preliminary data sections. Sometimes I get that question from clients as well. So let's say you've decided to describe all of your preliminary data at the beginning of the approach. It's a very typical thing that people will do, and they'll just list out their studies. And let's say they have 6 or 8 studies. At the bottom, you could have a final header that says summary of preliminary data, and you give a short paragraph that kind of summarizes a synthesis of all of the findings of your preliminary data. So just to give you an idea of the 2 places in the approach where you might see this, here's one possible outline for the approach. So you would have C approach, and then you might have C1 overview, C2 team, background, C4 preliminary data, etc. So this is where you would list the preliminary data as they apply to the entire project, versus a situation like this where a lot of your subheaders are under each aim because potentially each of these items varies by aim. So it doesn't make sense for you to discuss the preliminary data or the methods or the data analyses as they pertain to the whole project. You prefer to put them underneath the aim. So in this instance, you might have, aim 1 prelim data, aim 2 prelim data, etc. I do like to number the studies. I like disambiguation in terms of the way you create your outline, because I think it facilitates discussion among reviewers. That's my personal preference. Try and imagine that there is a room of 25 or 30 people who are trying to talk about your grant application, and they're trying to refer to some specific section within your grant application. It's always easier if each item has a unique identifier. It makes it easier for the reviewers to refer to it during the discussion. So in this instance, I gave you an example of if you were to list it all together at the beginning of the approach, you might list pilot study 1, pilot study 2, and list what the key take-home message is. So my preference is to have the take-home message bolded. The use of our novel smartphone app appears to be feasible in the target population. And then subheaders might be method, results, and next step. In the proposed project, we plan to deploy the use of our novel app in a larger cohort by, et cetera. So, and then summary of preliminary data. So hopefully that is clear to people. I'm happy to take questions on that. I know that this is a time when people may be, trying to write up their preliminary data within their grant application. So I thought it would be a good time to review that. And I had a couple of new samples in my Master the R-series course, so I thought I would just present that to people. So if anybody has questions, let me know. And otherwise, I'm going to start to answer the questions that we're getting. So in the Q&A box, I have this question. I have ESI status, so early stage investigator status, which means 10 years or less from your terminal degree, and you have not yet been a PI on an R01 or equivalent. So I have ESI status and would like to submit under the Katz mechanism. Would you recommend submitting 2 applications in the same cycle or put them in 2 separate cycles? So I'm not sure so for people who don't know, the Katz is a specialized type of R01 that is open only to early stage investigators, and you're not allowed to report preliminary data on the Katz. So often people will put an R01 application into a Katz when they're early. It's meant to be a change of direction for an ESI. So it's kind of like a bigger R21, if you will. And you absolutely can't report preliminary data on it. Sometimes people will hold back preliminary data on a Katz, submit an application as a Katz, and then gather more preliminary data in the 9 months that you're waiting for a decision on funding. And then if it's not funded, they'll have enough data to put it in as, like a parent R21 or even a parent R01 if they have enough data. So when you say, would you recommend submitting 2 applications in the same cycle or put them in 2 separate cycles? Do you mean submitting, for example, 2 separate and non-overlapping projects, one to a Katz and one to a parent R01? I think that's what you're asking me. If that's what you're asking me, there's no harm in submitting them to the same cycle because they're going to different study sections. As long as there's no overlap between them. If you're asking me, should I put in 2 Katz projects in the same cycle, that I probably wouldn't do. I don't know how a study section would respond to that. Probably what I would do instead is contact the program officer on the Katz ESI R01 and pitch both projects to that person and see how they respond to it. If I'm not mistaken, the Katz has, I think there's 3 deadlines a year, if I'm not mistaken, but maybe I'm wrong on that. I think it's the DP2 and DP5 that have 1 per year. But what you could do is put them in sequential cycles, as long as you still have ESI when you put them in. So I hope that I answered that question. If I misunderstood somehow, please let me know. Okay, let me pull up the questions I got during the week. Okay, I'm going to start with a really easy one that I get asked a lot that I can answer pretty quickly. So this question was about contradictory information that you're getting between your senior investigators and your pre-award support office. So, and it can often be challenging to be a junior faculty when you're stuck in the middle between these 2 entities, both of whom are convinced that they are correct. So the take-home message is, when in doubt, always ask your program officer. But I'm happy to weigh in on this one because I do know the answer. So in this particular instance, the person said, the senior investigators on my R01 team have insisted we submit instruments, in other words, like surveys and an interview guide. My grants management officer has told me she has never seen a PI submit instruments with their R01. The grants officer has pulled the RFA boilerplate language, which suggests that the surveys and interview questions, not an entire guide, are permissible. And in fact, as long as the RFA, so this is to an RFA, it's not to a parent announcement, but she actually lists the information out in this email to me from the RFA. And it is, the information is what is typically allowed in an NIH appendix. So and that's very limited, the information allowed in an NIH appendix. So for those of you who are submitting with very senior people, they may have remembered a time when a lot of information was allowed in the appendices, and that changed a while back because I think reviewers felt like applicants were using that to circumvent the page limits. But in this instance, her senior investigators are correct. So you can submit not an entire guide, but definitely blank questionnaires and survey forms are very, very typically allowed, and they should be submitted as an appendix. That's how that information, because that was one of her questions too. Is it permissible to submit survey drafts with modules and items in Word or Excel? So I'm not sure what she means by survey drafts, but you can submit blank survey forms and blank questionnaires. That is definitely allowed. And then she asked if yes, where should we put them in the appendix? And the answer is yes, in the appendix. And she did her due diligence to look at the NOFO to make sure that that is what the language says. In SF 424, it definitely says you can submit blank questionnaires and blank surveys. But remember, you always have to check your NOFO because the NOFO instructions supersede SF 424. Okay, so more emailed questions. What stage do publications need to be at for citation in the research strategy? So she says, can they be in press or accepted? So certainly in press, like if they're accepted for publication, I would just list them as in press. So you can definitely list that as preliminary data, if you want to list it that way. If something is in preparation, you can't list it as like, you could say in the narrative of your preliminary data write-up that this information is currently being prepared as a manuscript. An even better place to say that would be the personal statement of your biosketch, where you're talking about the number of publications that you have, which ones are first or last author, and which ones are currently being written up, particularly if you think it's going to be published and that information updated within the post-submission material window, because that alerts reviewers to go look at the post-submission material, which I'm not convinced they're always doing. So I would say in the research strategy, you can talk about things that are in press. And in the personal statement of your biosketch, you can talk about things that are in preparation. I wouldn't list them as your citations, but in the narrative part, you can talk about them being in preparation. And I would specifically say we anticipate that this will be in press and that we will be updating that information via the post-submission material mechanism. And that reminds reviewers to go look at that. Another question was acronyms in the Ames headlines. What is your guidance on using them? And I think this person means in the Ames page in general. And she says, I'm currently using acronyms in the Ames so that reviewers have fewer words to read in the headlines. It depends on the number of acronyms, but typically I like to define commonly used acronyms that will be commonly used in the research strategy. I define them in two places. One of them is on the Ames page. One of them is at the beginning of the research strategy. And sometimes I will just do it here and there where they come up in usage. So it's just kind of like a generic way, like a germane way to do it. Or I'll make an acronym box that I put in the upper right corner. And actually, in mid-October, I have a mini tutorial about how to deal with acronyms. But I did want to show you just really quickly one slide. I know this is an Ames page, but I'm just going to share this one slide. So this is typically how I would define acronyms within the AIMS page, even though actually this slide is part of the significance, but I would define the acronym and then put the acronym in blue. And, again, here in blue. And then when a reviewer is skimming the AIMS page, there are just some blue acronyms that they can very quickly scan back and find the information that they're looking for. So all of the slides that I'm presenting today are part of Master the R-series, just so you know, everybody on this call has access to that course. Okay, so let's see. Let me go back to my list of questions because I think I had at least one other. Yes. So, and we have a few more minutes. So if anybody wants to type another question in, feel free. But one of the emailed questions was, in terms of expected results for each aim within the research strategy, should this be high level or granular? I'm wary of repeating our aims, goals, methods, hypotheses, and I've written it as a one paragraph high level summary. I would say high level is probably right in terms of expected results. Sometimes your expected results are really formulaic, like you're either going to discover that a tool is feasible and acceptable or not. Like it's very binary, yes or no. But often there's nuance here. And, like you have some idea of what the expected result might be, or some sense of the direction that an expected result might take you. But sometimes there are surprises. So you could just keep it high level. And sometimes people bundle their expected results with potential problems and alternative strategies. So you could talk about, we're expecting, this result, but if we were to get something different, it might indicate, that something else is going on, in which case we would do this other set of experiments to explore that possibility. So it can become a place where you combine your expected results with your potential problems and alternative strategies. So just a thought about how to deal with that. So I think that was all I had for the emailed questions, and I don't seem to have any more questions typed in. So I'm just going to wrap up and remind you that on our next session is on September 4th. The two in September are September 4th and 18th. And those are going to be straight up Q&A so that I can best support people who are submitting applications in October and early November. And then as we move into October and we start to gradually move out of the last cycle, cycle 3 of 2024, we're going to shift gears and start talking about the new scoring criteria. So that will be on October 2nd. And then we have some guests lined up for a little later in the fall. So yeah, so that's what we have coming up. And a reminder that master resubmissions update will be appearing in the library in the next week or two for those of you who are working on your resubmission. For those of you who are participating in organizational library memberships, we are getting ready to launch a second Q&A platform, which is going to be First Fridays. That's going to be, the first one is going to be on September 6th. And that goes for half an hour starting at 11:30 Eastern time. And it'll be the first Friday of every month. It won't be recorded. There'll be no guests or mini tutorials. It's just very, very casual. People can drop in and ask questions. So we're going to beta test this as a once a month drop-in Q&A with our organizational library members. And of course, if you can't make any of these sessions, you can always email me your questions and I'll answer them in Ask the Grant Writing Expert, which is recorded and available on your dashboard. So you can always go and look at the answers to those questions there. So, and that is time. So I thank you all, as always, for attending. And I wish you the very best of luck in your grant writing application. And I will see you all on September 4th for Q&A for the Cycle 3 application. So best of luck. Have a great week, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.